There is a silent psychological wound carried by people who feel invisible, and it rarely begins in adulthood. It starts early, often in environments where attention was conditional, love was inconsistent, or emotional expression went unnoticed. The brain, especially during formative years, learns through patterns. When a person repeatedly experiences being ignored, talked over, or emotionally dismissed, the mind slowly absorbs a dangerous belief. My presence doesn't matter. This belief doesn't arrive suddenly. It grows quietly, reinforced by small moments that seem insignificant on their own but devastating when accumulated. Over time, the individual adapts not by demanding visibility, but by minimizing themselves. Psychology calls this adaptive behavior a survival response, not a weakness. The mind chooses invisibility as protection, believing that being unseen is safer than being rejected. And so the habit of shrinking begins not because the person lacks value, but because their nervous system learned that standing out was emotionally unsafe. As this pattern continues, the brain rewires itself to avoid emotional risk. People who feel invisible often become hyper-aware of others while remaining disconnected from themselves. They listen deeply, observe carefully, and anticipate reactions, not because they are naturally submissive, but because their mind learned that awareness reduces pain. This heightened sensitivity becomes both a strength and a burden. On the surface, they appear calm, agreeable, and emotionally controlled. Internally, however, there is a constant monitoring of the environment, a quiet fear of being misunderstood, overlooked, or dismissed once again. Psychology shows that this state of hypervigilance keeps the nervous system in a low-level survival mode, where rest feels unfamiliar and self-expression feels dangerous. The tragedy is that the world often mistakes this quiet adaptation for indifference, reinforcing the very invisibility the person is trying to survive. One of the most misunderstood aspects of invisibility is silence. Many assume that people who feel invisible simply lack confidence or assertiveness. But psychology reveals something deeper. Silence is often learned, not chosen. When speaking up repeatedly leads to dismissal, interruption, or emotional punishment, the brain stops seeing expression as rewarding. Instead, it associates voice with vulnerability. Over time, thoughts remain internal, emotions go unshared, and needs stay unmet, not because they don't exist, but because the mind learned that expressing them changes nothing. This internalization creates a heavy emotional load. Feelings don't disappear when they aren't expressed. They turn inward, manifesting as self-doubt, emotional fatigue, and a chronic sense of being disconnected from life. The person begins to feel like a background character in their own existence. Psychology also shows that invisibility often distorts identity. When someone grows up without consistent acknowledgement, they struggle to define themselves outside of others' perceptions. Their sense of self becomes externally anchored. Who am I useful to? Instead of, who am I? This leads to people-pleasing, emotional overgiving, and self-sacrifice that feels automatic rather than intentional. The invisible person learns to earn belonging by being needed, not by being authentic. But this creates a painful paradox. The more they give, the less they feel seen. Because visibility is not created through usefulness, but through recognition. And when recognition never comes, the individual internalizes a subtle but damaging belief. If I stop giving, I will disappear completely. Another psychological consequence of feeling invisible is emotional numbness. When emotions are repeatedly ignored, the brain eventually reduces their intensity to protect itself. This is not emotional maturity, it is emotional shutdown. The nervous system, overwhelmed by unmet emotional needs, chooses detachment as relief. People in this state often describe feeling empty, disconnected, or emotionally flat. They function, perform, and survive, but rarely feel alive. Psychology explains that this numbness is not the absence of emotion, but the suppression of it. Beneath the surface, unprocessed feelings continue to exist, waiting for a moment of safety to emerge. And when they do, they often appear as anxiety, burnout, or sudden emotional collapse. Invisibility also shapes relationships. People who feel unseen often attract relationships where their emotional needs remain secondary, not because they seek neglect, but because familiarity feels safe. The brain prefers the known over the healthy, even when the known causes pain. This is why invisible people may stay in one-sided relationships, tolerate emotional distance, or struggle to set boundaries. Their nervous system interprets neglect as normal and emotional reciprocity as unfamiliar. Psychology calls this repetition compulsion, the unconscious attempt to resolve past emotional wounds by reenacting them. Unfortunately, this often deepens the feeling of invisibility rather than healing it. Yet, awareness changes everything. The moment a person recognizes that invisibility is learned, not inherent power returns. Psychology emphasizes that identity is not fixed. It is shaped through repeated internal narratives. When someone begins to question the belief, "I don't matter," they disrupt years of conditioning. This process is uncomfortable. It requires sitting with emotions long suppressed, expressing needs that once felt dangerous, and tolerating the anxiety of being seen. But growth never feels safe at first. The nervous system resists change, even positive change, because predictability feels safer than freedom. Learning to become visible does not mean becoming loud, aggressive, or dominant. It means becoming honest. Honest about emotions, honest about boundaries, honest about desires. Psychology shows that visibility begins internally, long before it appears externally. When a person starts acknowledging their own emotions, needs, and worth, they send a powerful signal to the brain, "I exist." This internal validation reduces dependence on external recognition. Slowly, the need to disappear weakens. Silence becomes a choice instead of a reflex. Presence becomes intentional instead of fearful. As visibility grows, discomfort appears. People who are comfortable benefiting from your invisibility may resist your change. This is a critical psychological test. Growth often threatens existing dynamics. The invisible person must learn that discomfort does not mean danger, that being misunderstood does not mean being wrong, that losing conditional acceptance is not the same as losing worth. Psychology teaches that self-respect often costs approval, but gains authenticity, and authenticity is the foundation of mental health. In the end, the psychology of invisibility is not a story of weakness, it is a story of adaptation. People who feel invisible are not broken. They are deeply conditioned survivors of emotional neglect. But survival is not the same as living. The moment you understand why your mind learned to disappear, you gain the ability to choose differently. Visibility begins when you stop asking for permission to exist, when you stop shrinking to fit emotionally unsafe spaces, when you realize that being seen starts with seeing yourself. And once that shift happens, invisibility loses its power because you are no longer willing to disappear for anyone.